Dear colleagues, thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm very happy to welcome you here at the Bank of Russia. We are starting the press conference by the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Ms. Elvira Nabiullina. And as tradition stands it, we will have the statement following the results of the Board of Directors meeting. Good afternoon. Today, the Board of Directors has decided to reduce the key rate to 7% per annum. And if economic conditions are in line with our forecast, we will look into further key rate reduction at one of the upcoming meetings. Let me dwell on the main factors behind the decision. First, annual inflation has already approached 4%. Our estimates suggest that as of the year end, it will fall within the range of 4 to 4.5%. Meanwhile, inflation is forecast to stand at 3.5 to 4% in the opening months of next year. This is largely associated with the fact that the VAT rate increase will be factored out from the calculation of annual inflation. This may be considered a purely technical factor. Sustainable trends point to inflation of about 4%. Second, inflation expectation of households and businesses remain elevated. Therefore, we stay focused on their dynamics. Right now, I will not highlight the figures we released last week. However, I would like to note that previously we abstained from posting the results of surveys on household inflation expectations during the week of silence. We have discussed this issue, and from now on we will publish these data as soon as they are released. It is essential that the market promptly receives the information which the Board of Directors consults when making its decision. The Bank of Russia will continue to publish its analytical commentary that summarizes and estimates expectations of households, businesses, and analysts, like previously after the week of silence. Third, monetary conditions are continuing to loosen. We expect that both previous and today's key rate decisions will underpin this trend. Market expectations for interest rates shifted downwards on the back of the signals in the follow-up to the board meetings in June and July. This was also driven by the shifting expectations for monetary policies of the US Fed and ECB as the economic growth outlook for the US and Euro are deteriorated. The decline in interest rates comes with an easing of non-price lending conditions in terms of maturities and volumes. The easing of both price and non-price monetary conditions contributes to expansion in lending. According to our estimates, corporate lending will rise by 7 to 10%, while retail lending will increase by 15 to 20% this year. Fourth, economic activity undershot the Bank of Russia's expectations in the second and early third quarter. This results from internal and external factors. This made us revise our 2019 GDP growth forecast from 1 to 1.5% to 0.8 to 1.3%. An important external factor is a slowdown in growth of the global economy, which has proven more tangible than expected due to, among other things, the growing contradictions in international trade. A weakening in domestic demand already reduced export quantities in the first half of the year, and we forecast that they will contract for a wide range of goods as of the year end. The deterioration in the global growth outlook also affects investment plans, though certainly business sentiment depends not only on external factors, but also on the business environment as a whole. In the first half of the year, growth in fixed capital investments slowed considerably, which is associated with, amongst other things, a rather sizable drop in public investment. According to our estimates, even with a revival in national project expenditures in the second half of the year factored in, total growth of gross fixed capital formation will come in at no higher than 1% of the year end. Consumer demand continues to make a positive contribution to GDP growth. This year, the expansion of lending continues to offer strong support to consumption growth. Loans, however, cannot be the main driver of growth in demand. Consumption growth will remain slack as household incomes stagnate. This year, we expect it to come in at 1 to 1.5% range. We have also updated our medium-term baseline forecast. Now we expect the dynamics of domestic and external demand to be more moderate in 2020 to 2021. The most notable revision has been made for export growth rates. This reflects the deteriorated world economic outlook amid rising trade tensions. As a result, we may only expect GDP growth to accelerate to 2 to 3% by the end of 2022, rather than in 2021. A high economic growth rate should primarily be driven by the shift to a more extensive implementation of national projects and other governmental measures aimed at removing structural constraints. This will promote an increase in investment demand and a quicker rise in labor productivity, household income, and, accordingly, consumption. Lending will sustainably expand over the entire forecast horizon, supporting economic growth. Corporate lending will annually increase at a pace of 6 to 10%, and household lending will grow by 10 to 15% each year. Mortgage loans will account for the bulk of household lending growth. Meanwhile, macro-prudential measures will gradually reduce the growth pace of consumer lending. We have updated the balance of payments to factor in the world economy dynamics, prices for oil and other Russian export staples. We assume a gradual decline in oil prices to $50 per barrel in 2021, as compared to $55 considered earlier. If external demand weakens, prices for other Russian exports will drop too. In such conditions, the current account balance will shrink from $83 billion, which is 5% of GDP, this year, to $28 billion, which is about 2% of GDP by 2022. Given the actual dynamics observed since the beginning of the year, we have also slightly lowered the 2019 forecast for the private sector's financial account balance from $50 to $40 billion. Later on, it is expected to gradually reduce to $20 billion by the end of 2022. I would like to emphasize once again that the fiscal rule mechanism smooths out the impact of a decrease in the current account balance on the domestic economic environment. However, it only pertains to oil price fluctuations. I would like to stress that we have slightly changed our approach to publishing forecast scenarios. The key rate decision relies on our baseline macroeconomic forecast and the analysis of uncertainties and risks for the baseline forecast specifically. This is the reason why we will continue to publish the baseline scenario 4 times a year in our press releases and monetary policy report following core meetings. We will release our supplementary scenarios, the high oil price scenarios and the risk scenario that assumes that prices will plunge in the same manner as the baseline scenario, but once a year in the monetary policy guidelines. It is determined by the essence of these scenarios that remains almost unchanged across the meetings. The 2020 and 2022 guidelines will be published on Monday. Winding up, I would like to comment on monetary policy prospects. After the 5 years of the evolution from tight to moderately tight and then to neutral monetary policy, we have finally entered the key rate range we consider as a probable neutral interval. Given today's decision, the key rate is at the top of this range, equaling from 6 to 7% in nominal terms, or from 2 to 3% in real terms, which is the same with inflation expected to reach 4%. In this regard, it is of note that the neutral key rate estimate is not a point, but a range of values. It depends on various domestic and global drivers, as well as the monetary policy transmission mechanism, and may alter being affected by them. It will therefore take time to feel the thresholds of this neutral range and make sure that they are in line with our current estimates. If necessary, we will adjust these estimates. A sustainable inflation rate close to the 4% target will be the key criterion suggesting that we're right in our estimates of this range. Thank you. And I'm ready now to answer your questions. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Yes, Gulia, please. Don't forget to introduce yourselves and name your agency. Gulnara Vahitova. Elvira Nabiullina, today the central bank changed its signal in its statement. Instead of the reviewing the key rate substantiation at one of the board of directors. Could you please tell us what is the difference between these two signals? Yes, we came out with a signal, and by the way, we already have previously applied the notion of assessing the appropriateness. And we believe it is probable to reduce the rate at one of the next board meetings, which is going to be one of the next 3. Yes, Andrei, go ahead. Good afternoon, Andrei Burikov from Bloomberg. From your statement, you deleted the forecast of the ability to achieve the neutral rate, and I understand that that applies to a possible change of the range in between 6 to 7%. But what is the probability of it going down, and within which time frame it may happen? And my second question, whether today you have discussed the changes of the Bank of China impairment standard by about 100 and 150 basis points. What kind of conclusion you have come to? In as far as the neutrality range is concerned, let me repeat it again. This is the estimate value, and it is based upon the modeling and upon an assessment of different indicators. So to give you a very precise view of that particular rate, because generally speaking, we're not so much worried by the key rate rather than the monitoring conditions to be neutral. That will require a continuous monitoring of the environment in terms of the achievability of the 4% target. So we do allow for such a revision, but currently we're not saying that we're definitely ready to reconsider it, although we do understand that the level of the global equilibrium rates may also go down. This is some of the things that we need to consider, like the country premium and the way the transmission mechanism is working, because once again, I shall repeat, we are very much keen to follow the environment as well. So once again, there is a probability of revision, but not exactly necessary that it will happen. We simply wanted to underscore because we entered into this neutrality interval that we've assessed previously. Now, in as far as the Bank of China activity is concerned, we didn't discuss that specifically because we're generally having a discussion whenever we consider the global economy, what is happening with different countries' economies and the financial markets. And so the Bank of China previously announced its activities, so in the overall set of factors, we did take it into account. Yes, Tatiana, go ahead. Tatiana Lomska, RBK. Could you please tell us? Over the past few years, the central bank's forecasts and the Minister of Economic Development on inflation looked similar. Currently, they're quite different, and so the Minister of Economy believes that this year and next year, the inflation target is not going to be reached. Do you see such a risk, and what do you think about it? Yes, we do have certain differences in the way we assess inflation for the current and the next years. Whenever we come up with our own estimate for this year, which is for 4.5, we do take into account the fact that as far as the majority of indicators are concerned, which describe the sustainable enablers of the inflation, and this is not just one indicator like monetary inflation, from which one deducts the regulated prices and so on and so forth. We review a very broad set, more than 20 indicators which characterize different aspects of inflation. And so based on the majority of indicators that we were able to see, the current level of inflation pressure conforms to about 4% level right now. On top of it, we do assess the factors which could be very probable in terms of manifesting themselves before the end of the year. Pro-inflation, inflation less, and we see them in a balance, in an equilibrium. So that's how we come with our forecast. As far as our expectations for next year are concerned, based on our analysis, the Ministries of Economic Development on inflation forecast, in the first place, reflects the dynamics of consumer lending, which we believe is unrealistic. 4% is unrealistic, the way we think in terms of the consumer lending dynamics. We assess the consumer lending dynamics at a level of about 10%. Like I mentioned, that overall, 10 to 15%. Mortgage is what we believe to grow at about 20%, while consumer lending at about 10%. And it will go down under the effect of our macroprudential measures. Our macroprudential measures are being taken with such an aim so as to ensure a very gradual reduction of the consumer lending growth. We do not see such a probability that will go down to 4%. Yes, Katja, please. Thank you very much. Over the past several months, there was quite a broad public debate about the way one should assess risks in the Basel III reform, and the central bank's position is to do its in-house assessment. And you now have several major opponents, Minister of Finance, Minister for Economic Development, and a number of major corporates. The time frame that the President set out in answer to the last letter was the end of August. Could you please tell us, has there already been a meeting chaired by the President, and do you expect any general points that you can work out with your opponents in this reform, and maybe you are ready to shift some of your ideas in terms of times or to soften them in terms of the execution? Well, in as far as such changes, and these are quite substantial changes in the bank regulation in terms of the risk management and mitigation, we've been quite serious in our attitude towards the ideas we received from our counterparts, from the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Economy, and from other companies. We have analyzed them. Actually, before then, our proposals and the proposals to apply different ratings, which previously had been voiced by some of the banks, we tested them and we have monitored the way it could have affected the banking system as well as the corporate lending. Yes, certainly, because everybody's interested in the way it may affect the corporate lending. So, based on the results of such an analysis and additional discussions, we kept the position that we previously had. And we believe that any approach without ratings is a more adequate one to the current environment, and, amongst other things, allows the banks to better assess risks related to the corporate lending, as well as enables them to lend to a broader range of companies rather than just the companies which can demonstrate higher ratings. And these companies may as well go to the capital markets. But nevertheless, the discussion, by the way, led to us now having certain common positions during the meetings, which was attended by us and Minister of Economy and Minister of Finance. It was initiated by the Minister of Economy in order to accelerate the transitions by the systemically important credit institutions to such an advanced approach. Because the better approach is when a bank, on the basis of its own data, using its data sets, taking into account its risk appetite, assesses these risks, and we validate such methodologies. It is quite natural and normal when major banking institutions, following the examples of such major banking institutions from other countries, may apply such an advanced approach. We've got only 2 banks who have switched to such an approach, and here we were able to come to a joint position that this needs to be incentivized. So, generally speaking, the approach for those who are not going to transform to such an advanced methodology, we believe, should be the one which is standardized, irrespective of the ratings. Yes, colleagues, Elena? Elena Potishova, TASS news agency. Recently, it has become known that the Central Bank and the Ministry of Finance decided to give up on the individual pension capital title. What is the reason? What will be the different name to it, and what is the status of the draft law? Because, it's not only about the name or the title, because we're not talking about renaming it. We do not see the sufficient readiness to introduce such a system, because otherwise one should focus upon perfecting the currently existing systems as well as developing voluntary pension accumulations and resolve such an acute issue, which unfortunately hasn't been resolved so far despite the changes in the legislation, so as to allow the citizens to really switch in between the government pension funds. That should be the focus. Yes, Nastya, please. Interfax agency. Do you believe that the August weakening of the ruble exchange rate by 5% may produce pressure upon inflation? Do you believe that this is a temporary phenomenon, or the fact of this weakening upon inflation is not going to be strong? And my second question, has there been any further development of the discussion about the National Welfare Fund expenditures? Yes, of course, the exchange rate dynamics does produce certain effect upon inflation. So the carry-forward rate has changed very strongly. We evaluate it now at less than 0.1%. The exchange rate fluctuations were very diverse in the course of the year. A certain result from such a depreciation of the current exchange rate may be viewed in the next few months. We do take into account in our forecast, we believe there's going to be in between 0.1% to 0.2% until the end of the year. Now, in as far as the National Welfare Fund is concerned, no, we're not having such a discussion right now. When we were today discussing our decision about the key rate, we were considering it as one of the uncertainty factors, effectively even a risk, because the mechanism as to which the money is being spent from the National Welfare Fund may considerably affect the macroeconomic dynamics and the forecasts. And we, by the way, in our monetary policy guidelines, and this is what we're going to publish on Monday, like I previously stated, we will have a special paragraph where we do a qualitative assessment of different scenarios of the way the money can be spent from the National Welfare Fund. We're going to further expose this topic. We need a very full-bodied discussion, and for our monetary policy, it is very needy to have certainty in it. Once again, I should underscore this, because I believe that many have already seen positive results from the application of the fiscal rule. I mean, in the way that our situation is getting more stable despite the external environment fluctuation. To sustain this fiscal rule in any approaches to the way the money should be spent from the National Welfare Fund. This is very important. That's what we're going to adhere to. Yes, dear colleagues, and as a tradition, we are receiving a question from one of our regional correspondents, Andrei Pushkaryov, the Golden Horn newspaper from the city of Vladivostok. Considering the volatility in this country, for example, the prices and other economic indicators, when prices may jump around, by 10, 15, even 20%, doesn't the approach of central bank seems to be overcautious in terms of the changes of the key rate, because such micro changes practically do not affect the general environment at all? Maybe it's about time to undertake more dramatic steps. Well, I would like to say that over the past few years we haven't seen such jumping around of inflation, because during the past 3 years these have been very moderate growth rates, although in certain commodity groups we do note this to be the case in terms of the vegetables and but volatility of prices, great fluctuations within a certain range of products, but overall the inflation is currently very close to 4%. So there is no need to undertake any major steps, which was the case when we were pursuing the policy of a very strong disinflation, from double-digit inflation to one-digit inflation. Nevertheless, the changes of our rate and the changes in inflation do affect the lending rates. Let me remind you, when in last year's July, twice we've raised the key rates, we did it to preempt the situation, and a retrospective analysis currently shows that that was done in a very correct way, because that in many ways enabled us to cushion the secondary effect, and that was why we didn't end up having a very considerable hike of inflation, which would have happened if we were not to go for that measure. So there was no rise of the rate, and so we were able to see that the rates in the economy also went up in the mortgage, and that reflected upon the mortgage lending growth rate. So we are lowering the rate, and so we do expect that overall in the economy the rates will go down. But we will continue this policy in order to maintain this inflation close to 4%, because such little steps are the ones which, under the current environment, specifically, are adequate. By the way, major measures and steps are being applied when certain conditions, external conditions, change very strongly. It could only be justified in such a situation. We don't see it right now. Anna, please. Anna Kaledina is Vestia newspaper. Elvira Nabiullina, I apologize, but since my colleagues have raised the topic about the former, former exchange rate, key rate statements, and will there be any co-funding and tax measures from the government in order to incentivize the development? And one more question about the government pension funds. I'm not mistaken, the General Prosecutor's Office is supposed to come up with the results of its audit. Do you know the results already? And as far as the PK is concerned, now the discussion is still ongoing. Without doubt, we are for developing the accumulation component in the pension system, because we believe this is a very important part in order to improve the well-being of the pensions for the long-term investments. Let me not repeat all of the arguments again. You're quite right. There is also a potential in place in improving the current system of pension accumulations, which is something that we are discussing, amongst other things. As far as the switching in between the government pension funds is concerned, no, I'm not yet familiar with the results of the General Prosecutor's audit. We expect that certain problems are going to be exposed because we do see them. Very recently, I convened the heads of the pension funds to discuss the problems of such transitions. Despite the kind of existing legislation, we do note the acts of unfair competition when people are being lured from one fund to another fund. People are losing their incomes, their life savings, and in order to, we need to resolve this problem because it hasn't yet been resolved. Yes, colleagues, Arseny, please, go ahead. Good afternoon, Arseny Malchanev, Russia 24. I'd like to find out, are there any interim results of introducing the escrow accounts and how the banking industry is faring? The mortgage, is it being funded, and the construction? And my second question about the blocking of accounts, because the Minister of Economic Development recently proposed to liberalize accounts, to stop freezing the accounts in case of certain ambiguous and dubious operations. The Central Bank is supporting it. And as far as the escrow accounts are concerned, we are conducting a continuous monitoring about the way the transfer to the new system is taking place regionally. The results are quite different in between different regions. I cannot recall from my mind because I don't have the figures in front of me. If my memory serves me right, about 30%, I need to be more specific, of the developers are already being funded with escrow accounts. Quite a big share of them remains on the old system because there is a big share of readiness of various development facilities. And there is also quite a big number of developers who are not having any right to be funded according to the old scheme and cannot get the funding according to the new scheme. And that is the focus of our attention. Why is it happening? Is it the inability to prepare correctly the documents? We see that because not all of the developers are ready to work with the banks like that. In a number of instances, there aren't any documents, confirming documents, with the local authorities are supposed to come up with in order to give it to the bank. But some of the projects simply don't fit to the bank financing. The government came out with the measures which will enable to support such projects, so we are maintaining a permanent contact. So speaking generally, yes, there are problems. This is not an easy process, not a straightforward one. In it, very serious changes in the way the construction industry's funding is being changed, but it is going in a very gradual, very step-by-step, and very predictable way. This may lead to a certain growth of the value of real estate, but that is going to be a temporary factor, and I mean residential real estate. Along with the development of the competition, we hope that everything will reach a proper trajectory. As far as the mortgage part of it is concerned, yes, indeed, there has been a certain decline in the mortgage development rate. Firstly, the rates went up, they're currently going down. And secondly, the demand for the mortgage refinancing also shrunk because the mortgage rates, when they were going down, many people simply went for refinancing, and when they started growing back up again, they stopped. So you have to be very diligent about it, because we do see that the mortgage lending shall continue growing because there are good conditions for it. And like I've mentioned, for next year, we're targeting about 20% of the mortgage lending growth rate. As far as account blocking in freezing is concerned, because of the anti-money laundering legislation, this is the topic that we've been following a long time ago, because sometimes banks abuse their right to refuse a customer if there are any indications of the anti-money laundering things. We have improved, having taken this into account because of various complaints and working with the Association of the Small and Medium Businesses. We have improved our work with the bank, as well as the criteria for identifying risk operations. We set in place the appeal mechanism. When somebody is quoting the figures that at the level of the Central Commission there are very few cases that are being considered, it is indeed true, because most of the cases are being considered at the level of the banks. They don't want to escalate it to the level of the Commission, because the level of the Commission is the next one, and some major conclusions are going to be made in this case. So we believe, although this problem is not ultimately resolved, but there is certain positive improvement, we would be eager to consider additional measures, and if they are in a good balance, they won't open the window for dubious operations, because we are against the financial sector to be an easy channel for money laundering. That's definitely. But without doubt, protecting law-abiding customers, and we need to develop the instruments and a well-balanced policy in order to protect the rights of the law-abiding customers, and we're ready to work further on this. Thank you. Yes, sir, Jenny, please. Thank you. Bloomberg Agency, Evgenia Pismenaya. Let me go back to the monetary policy issues. And my other colleagues previously asked a question about the Minister of Economic Development forecast and the central bank's forecast. That really confuses us, because in the past it seems that the government inflation forecast was well concerted with the central bank target, and such a forecast should raise the level of trust to inflation targeting. Currently, you are having very different forecasts, so we don't understand who we should trust more and how we should sort it out. This is my comment. It would be great if you can respond. I will be quite appreciative. I've written down here several statements from the Minister of Economy forecast purposefully. Again, they're very different. You've given yourself a kudo for having raised the rate 2 times. That was a correct decision. But in the Minister of Economic Development forecast, it says a totally different thing. For example, Minister Oreshkin is writing, changes in the monetary policy not only have been compensated by the monetary policy, moreover, its changes strengthen the negative effect upon the aggregate demand. That was in the official document. And the fact that in September and December 2018, the central bank twice raised the key rate, and I'm simply reiterating this narrative myself, in order to preempt no VAT hike, the Minister of Economy believes that to be an erroneous decision. So under such conditions, the dynamics of investments into the fixed capital also worsened. Let me not quote it anymore, because there are many more things, I'm sure that you read it. I simply want to understand, is there any conflict between you? Do you see the situation differently? Is the government dissatisfied with your monetary policy? What are we to think of it? And I don't know. Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. The differences in between the Minister of Economy's forecast and the central banks have always been there, and we have been debating them. You might be right that these are the differences which are about inflation this time. Nevertheless, and by the way, in terms of the GDP forecast, despite these differences, we are very close in between ourselves and the Minister of Economy. We are very close as well. about the external demand, global external demand dynamics, and the way it affects the Russian economics. Very close. We are different in our positions, like I've explained, in terms of consumer lending and, respectively, about inflation, because differences pertaining to inflation, as viewed by experts, have been brought about by the differences in assessing the consumer lending dynamics. But I've shared with you already my opinion. We believe that these estimates are too downplayed because we are not having running to the objective of reducing the consumer lending because there are no risks to the financial stability right now. In as far as the past decisions are concerned, you may recall that for the first quarter this year we came up with a higher inflation estimates because we were expecting greater secondary effect from VAT. And when post factum we assessed the VAT transfer effect ended up being at the lower threshold of our forecast. And we used to say that there's a great uncertainty for us, and so we're going for a preemptive measure. But one of the reasons as to why in the first quarter the inflation ended up being lower than what we forecast, not because of the preemption on our part, but because the government investment, the government demand became much lower than what we expected, because we used to say that one shouldn't expect results from the national projects immediately. It would be impossible to spend the funds over the night, which we derive from the tax collection, but the actual situation turned out to be much worse. The government investments went down almost twice, and that affected the aggregate demand, we believe. And that is why the fiscal and the monetary policies in the first quarter of the year particularly were very tough, and reviewing our forecast in terms of the public expenses, we align it with the fiscal and monetary policy. Well, to my mind, it's a normal working kind of a situation. Colleagues, Mikhail, please. Mikhail Chegin, Newsroom, Elvira Nabiullina. Thank you very much for commenting the Minister of Economic Development assessment of the growth of the consumer lending. Could you also comment on what they think about the growth in the real disposable income by just 0.1% next year, and share with us the central bank's internal view, because from the updated forecast it could be concluded that the Russians and the population of Russia is going to feed the whole of the economic development. Unfortunately, the real income dynamics is unsatisfactory, and our assessment very close to what the Minister of Economic Development thinks for this year. Undoubtedly, the problem of real income should in the first place be resolved on the basis of economic growth, sustainable economic growth. Real income, is something that is being affected by a multiplicity of factors, including how much people pay on their loans. We understand it, but the main driver which affects the individual income, economic activity, the growth in the labor productivity, and efficient investment projects. And we, despite these delays in national project execution, we put into our base scenario a certain normalization in terms of the spending, and that there will be economic growth on that basis, which will transform itself into the growth of the real incomes. Thank you. Colleagues, sorry, another question comes from the regions. Stanislav Chernievsky, the first city channel from the city of Omsk. Some of the experts are saying that the central bank's policy is aimed at an excessive growth of the gold and hard currency reserves. In this way, the oil and gas money is taken out of the turnover without doing good for the economy. No high-tech production is working. No new jobs are being created. Real incomes are not growing. And the economy turns itself into the resource kind of an economy and very vulnerable. So those who are championing it are saying that the capital should work for the economy. Otherwise, it is not a capital or just a treasure put aside. Could you comment on this? Yes, sir, thank you. The gold and hard currency reserves we are accumulating indeed in order to maintain a cushion of safety. This country, as any other country, requires such a safety cushion, because the history of the crisis period in this country demonstrates that an existence of such a safety cushion may seriously dampen the aftermath, both for the economy as well as for the well-being of the population. So being aware that this economy continues to be strongly dependent upon the export of commodities because the prices and the demand for them are quite volatile. It is important also for the economy and for the level of the well-being not to be as dependent upon the external environment. And so such a safety cushion allows us to do that. Without doubt, the economic development should be supported by the finance. We're very well aware of it, but we've got money in our economy, and if, for example, you take a look at the amount of funds that the companies maintain on their accounts, how the corporate profits are growing, they have their own money in order to invest into their own economics and into the production. And the investment climate is very important so that the businesses are incentivized to do that. And certainly the government spending, if they are being done according to the plans, will also support economic growth. Yes, Julia, go ahead. Good afternoon, Julia Makareva, Russia 24 TV channel. Elvira Nabiullina, I've got two questions. The first, on the eve, several days ago, there came out an information about central bank collecting statistical data from various financial institutions about various fraud activities with electronic signatures. Could you please tell us, have there been any data collected already? Do you collect such data? And what are you going to do with it? What kind of conclusions, what kind of decisions you may come up to? And my second question, yesterday, Oleg Deripaska made a statement. He believes that some of the central bank's authority should be delegated to the antitrust authority. Could you respond to this businessman and comment on what he said, please? As far as the fraudulent activities are concerned with using electronic signatures, with the development of remote digital technologies and services, definitely the landscape of fraudsters and what they do changes. And that is why we are continuously monitoring of what becomes proliferated in order to safeguard the citizens from fraudsters. We are doing this monitoring. We don't have yet any generalized conclusions, but we'll definitely be sharing those with you in the future. Now, in as far as the central bank and the reform of the central bank is concerned, there is a law in place which defines our authority, and so we are working in full compliance with it. Yes, Andrei, please. Andrei Ostrouch, Reuters. I wanted to ask you to be more specific about the curate, because you said that at one of the next few board meetings you may probably consider lowering it further. Is it possible that it would get lowered both in October and December? This is my first question. And my second question, when are you going to announce that the rate has reached a neutral level? Don't you expect that this may bring about divestiture in the OFZ market, because the investors may start running from these papers? In as far as the key rate decision is concerned, we'll definitely be assessing the appropriateness, and our conclusions will be dependent upon the information we are going to receive, because there are so many uncertainties. We've mentioned that. Just to tell you in advance what these decisions are going to be is impossible. So this is the formula that we are following. We do see, and we will considering the appropriateness of it at one of the next few meetings, which means the next three. As far as the neutral rate is concerned, neutral level, as I said, we have entered into the neutral rate interval. It is a broad one. I'm afraid that we will never be able to specifically pinpoint and say that this is the neutral rate now. This is just an area. This is not a point. So we won't be able to identify the point because we're somewhere within this area. It is extremely important for us to be able to see that the level of the rate assures us of the 4% inflation on the basis of our forecast. So once again, let me reiterate, this is a bit of a conditionality, the level of neutrality. You may know that other central banks are discussing it because the level of a neutral rate is very difficult to measure and to come out unequivocally and say that is what it is. And what was the other one? No, we're not expecting it. Dear colleagues, and please the last question for this press conference. Gulia, please. The central bank last week announced that the aggregate debt burden for the households reached the peak of 2014, which is 10.4%. Doesn't the central bank see the need, because of it, to introduce certain additional restriction measures, because the central bank stated that such a growth occurred primarily because of the consumer loans, bearing in mind the fact that you mentioned that you expect 10% growth in consumer lending? It is true that consumer loans are growing at a high pace. We've always noted it. And I shall repeat it again. Currently, we do not see the risk to financial stability. One should rather not scare anybody with any financial bubbles, but without doubt, the rates of growth are quite high. The fact that they are high and may create risks for the future is something that we've started looking into a long time ago, because we instituted macroprudential measures back in 2018, and we announced that on October 1st we will introduce a new regulatory instrument, which is going to be the ratio of debt burden for the Russian banking system. We announced it 12 months ago, before all of the current year's discussions started, understanding that in the end of the day, the consumer lending, like I mentioned, must and should not be the main driver behind the economic growth. And yes, consumer loans are growing at a tangible pace, but first and foremost, the debt burden ratio is growing because of the stagnation of incomes. Because if you take a look at a debt burden, what is it? It is a denominator and economic, because if you take a look about the way the consumer loans have grown, let's consider it from January 1st to 2015, since the beginning of all of these events. If you take a look at it in real terms, the consumer loans grew by about 5.4%. It's just that our incomes during the same period of time went down, so the debt burden ratio grew. And of course, in order for the burden upon household not to grow, it is necessary to make sure that the household incomes are growing. Yes, unfortunately, people in households with low incomes, in order to support their consumption level, are taking more loans. And that may turn out to be a danger to them. And that is why it is important to introduce the debt burden ratio, so that these people trying to support their consumption level would end up being in a much greater debt. So this is the ratio that is going to be introduced. And this is a very tough instrument compared to what we used to apply in the past. Actually, the 4 times that we increased the ratio, and we see now that there is a bit of a monthly depletion of the lending activity. That is the aftermath of the previous measure, but we do expect that this debt burden ratio is going to be a much more tangible measure. We will monitor the way this ratio will work. In the meantime, we do not see the need to apply any additional measures. If we feel that it is necessary, we will go for it. By the way, next week, we would like to publish a report for public discussion about the macroprudential measures in retail lending, generalizing on the other countries' experience, because apart from the instruments that we're applying, there are certain others that can be used, so we would like to discuss them. So if we're ready to go for them, based on what we discussed with the markets, we'll need to introduce changes into the legislation in order to enjoy a much more comprehensive tool set. So we believe first thing that needs to be done is to take a look at the fact of this debt burden ratio's introduction, what it is doing. Colleagues, thank you very much. Sorry, our time is up.